The Amazon River is not a single entity. It is a collection of moods, and tonight, its mood was murderous. The locals called it the repiquet, a sudden, violent rise in water levels caused by heavy rains miles upstream in the Andes. The water didn't just rise, it surged, turning the lazy brown channels into churning highways of destruction, carrying entire uprooted trees, dead livestock, and the debris of shattered docks toward the Atlantic. Captain Marcus gripped the tiller of his aluminum skiff with a white-knuckled intensity. The outboard motor whined, fighting the chaotic current that threatened to spin the small craft around and smash it against the submerged trunks lining the bank. He shouldn't be out here. No one should. But the perimeter alarms on the northern sector of his property had tripped, likely a tapir or a falling branch, and the discipline ingrained in him by 20 years of service wouldn't let him ignore a potential breach, even in a monsoon. Beside him, Max was miserable but steadfast. The German shepherd was soaked to the bone, his sable fur plastered to his muscular frame. He stood at the bow, feet planted wide for balance, shielding his eyes from the driving rain. Max wasn't looking for intruders. He was reading the river. In conditions like this, eyes were useless. The rain reduced visibility to zero, but the dog could feel the vibration of heavy objects in the water, and he could smell fear over the scent of ozone and mud. Marcus adjusted his tactical goggles, wiping the water away. He decided to abort. The river was rising too fast. The water level had climbed 3 feet in the last hour. It was suicide to stay out. He began to bank the skiff around, aiming for the relative safety of the tributary that led to his shack. That was when Max reacted. The dog didn't bark. A bark would be lost in the roar of the wind. Instead, Max spun around, scrambled over the center bench, and grabbed the sleeve of Marcus's rain jacket with his teeth. He yanked hard, pulling Marcus's arm to the right, toward the center of the raging channel. Marcus looked at the dog. Max released the sleeve and lunged back to the starboard side, staring into the pitch-black void of the river, his body rigid, ears swiveling frantically. Marcus trusted the dog's instincts more than his own navigation equipment. He swung the spotlight mounted on the gunnel toward the direction Max was indicating. The beam of light cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating the chaotic surface of the water. Logs, branches, mats of floating grass rushed by at terrifying speeds. And then he saw it. Caught in the snare of a massive fallen samauma tree that had been swept into the middle of the river, bobbing violently in the turbulence, was a wooden canoe. It was half sunk, pinned against the dead branches by the force of the current. And inside, there was life. A woman. She was clinging to the wet bark of the dead tree with one hand, fighting the river that tried to drag her under. In her other arm, held high above the spray, was a bundle, a baby. Behind her, huddled in the awash hull of the canoe, 2 small children gripped the gunnels, their faces masks of frozen terror. They weren't screaming. They were too busy trying to breathe. The river was tearing the canoe apart. The wood groaned audibly over the storm. If the boat broke free, they would be swept into the rapids downriver, where the rocks would grind them to paste. Marcus slammed the throttle forward. The skiff leaped, its bow slamming down hard on the chop. He had to approach from downstream, fighting the current to hold position, or he would smash into them. It was a maneuver that required surgical precision. One mistake, and he would crush the fragile canoe with his aluminum hull. He brought the skiff alongside, the engine roaring as he fought to match the speed of the drifting tree. The gap closed. 3 yards, 2 yards. Max was already at the rail, whining, ready to jump. "Stay!" Marcus roared. He got within reaching distance. The woman looked up. Her hair was plastered across her face. She was indigenous, her skin pale from hypothermia, her eyes wide, dark pools of panic. She looked at Marcus, a giant in tactical rain gear, wearing night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead, and she didn't see a rescuer. She saw another threat. She clutched the baby tighter, shrinking away. She was going to let the river take her rather than trust a stranger. Marcus killed the engine into neutral for a split second, letting the momentum carry him closer. He leaned over the gunnel, extending his hand. He didn't have time to be gentle. He didn't have time to negotiate. The tree branch holding the canoe gave a sickening crack. "Give me the baby," Marcus shouted in Portuguese, his voice projecting with the command authority he used to move troops under fire. "The tree is breaking. Give me the child." The woman hesitated. The river surged, washing over the children in the canoe. Then she made a choice. She thrust the bundle toward him. Marcus grabbed the infant, wrapped in wet cloth, with one arm, and swung the child into the safety of the skiff, depositing the bundle on the floor near the fuel tank. Max immediately stood over the baby, shielding it from the rain with his body. "Now you! Move!" Marcus grabbed the two children one by one, hauling them over the rail by their shirts, tossing them onto the deck like sacks of flour. They were light, shivering, their skin ice cold. Finally, the woman. The canoe cracked loudly, splitting down the middle. She lost her footing. She slipped into the black water. Marcus lunged. His hand closed around her wrist. The current grabbed her legs, pulling with the force of a freight train. Marcus braced his knees against the side of the boat, his shoulder muscles screaming as he fought the river for her life. He roared with effort, heaving backward. She flew over the rail, landing in a heap on the metal floor of the skiff, coughing up water. A second later, the dead tree snapped. The remains of her canoe were sucked under the surface and vanished into the darkness. They were adrift in the storm. Marcus scrambled back to the tiller and gunned the engine, fighting to regain control before the skiff turned broadside to the waves. He steadied the boat, pointing the bow toward the hidden inlet of his home. He looked down at the floor of the boat. The woman was crawling toward the baby, checking for breath. The other two children were huddled against Max, burying their faces in the dog's wet fur. She looked up at him. She was shivering violently, but her jaw was set. She didn't say thank you. She looked at him with the wariness of a wounded animal that has escaped a trap only to find itself in a cage. Marcus met her gaze. He shouted over the wind, "My name is Marcus. You are safe. I'm taking you to high ground." He turned his eyes back to the river. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold realization. He had gone out to check a sensor. He was coming back with a family. The solitude he guarded so carefully had just been breached, not by an enemy, but by a force of nature. And looking at the fierce protection in the woman's eyes, he knew this storm was just the beginning. The journey from the main river channel to the hidden inlet where Marcus kept his base of operations was a distance of less than 3 miles. But in the teeth of a flash flood event, distance is measured not in miles, but in minutes of survival. The skiff fought for every inch of forward progress. The outboard motor, a workhorse Yamaha usually reliable as a Swiss watch, screamed in protest as the propeller churned against the sheer volume of water rushing downstream. The river had become a solid, moving muscle, trying to push them back into the chaotic throat of the storm. Marcus stood at the tiller, his body angled against the driving rain, his eyes narrowed behind the night vision goggles. The green-tinted world of the NVGs revealed a nightmare landscape. The water level had risen high enough to submerge the lower branches of the trees, turning the riverbanks into a maze of snagged timber and swirling eddies. He had to navigate by memory and instinct, feeling the subtle shifts in the hull's vibration that indicated shallow water or submerged logs. His hands, though gloved, were numb from the cold spray, but his grip remained iron-tight. He knew that if the engine died now, the current would smash the aluminum hull against a tree trunk within seconds, spilling his passengers back into the black water. And this time, there would be no rescue. He glanced down at the floor of the boat. The situation was critical. The woman, Janaína, though he didn't know her name yet, was huddled in the fetal position over her children, her body acting as a desperate, shivering shield against the elements. The baby was silent, buried deep within the sodden bundle of cloth. The two older children were clinging to Max. The German shepherd, soaked and miserable, had instinctively laid his heavy body across their legs, using his own body heat to stave off the worst of the wind chill. The dog looked up at Marcus, his amber eyes wide and pleading in the green glow of the night vision, asking a question the veteran couldn't answer. How much longer? Marcus pushed the throttle to the stop. The engine roared, and the bow lifted slightly. He cut a sharp line through a patch of floating hyacinths, the hull shuddering as it tore through the vegetation. Finally, the dark outline of the stilt house appeared through the curtain of rain. It stood high on its reinforced pilings, a dark monolith of safety rising above the floodwaters. To Marcus, it was a tactical position. To the people on the floor of the boat, it must have looked like the gates of heaven. He guided the skiff into the boat slip beneath the house. The water here was calmer, protected by the bulk of the structure. He cut the engine. The sudden silence of the motor was instantly replaced by the roar of the rain on the tin roof above them. Marcus moved with the speed of a medic in a triage unit. He didn't wait for them to move. Hypothermia makes the limbs heavy and the mind slow. They likely couldn't move if they wanted to. He vaulted over the bench and scooped up the two older children, one under each arm. They felt impossibly light, like bundles of wet sticks. "Move! Up the ladder! Now!" he ordered the woman, his voice cutting through her daze. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the baby with a grip that turned her knuckles white. She looked at the ladder leading up to the trapdoor in the floor of the shack, a security feature Marcus had installed to avoid using the external stairs in emergencies. She hesitated, looking at the dark opening. "Go!" Marcus barked. "The cold is killing them." She climbed. Marcus followed, hauling the children up, with Max scrambling up the wooden rungs behind them with the agility of a cat. Inside, the shack was pitch black. Marcus kicked the trapdoor shut and threw the heavy iron bolt, sealing out the storm. The sound of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by the heavy, wet breathing of 5 living creatures in the dark. Marcus moved to his gear shelf by memory. He found the propane lantern and turned the valve. The hiss of gas was followed by the snick of a striker, and a warm, golden light flooded the room. The light revealed the extent of the damage. The children were blue, not pale, but a translucent, terrifying shade of violet around the lips and fingernails. They were in stage 2 hypothermia. Shivering had stopped, or was violent and uncontrollable. Confusion setting in. The woman was slumped against the wall, her eyes unfocused, her chest heaving. The veteran's training took over. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a corpsman. "Get those wet clothes off. All of them," Marcus commanded, turning his back to give them a modicum of privacy while he ripped blankets from his cot. He grabbed his own dry wool socks, thermal shirts, and anything that could hold heat. He spun around. The woman hadn't moved. She was staring at him with a glassy, terrified expression, clutching the baby so tight she might be suffocating it. She wasn't processing his words. She was in shock. Marcus stepped forward. He knelt in front of her. He didn't touch her. He lowered his voice, channeling the calm authority he used to de-escalate panic in civilians during extraction ops. "Listen to me. The water steals the heat. If they stay in wet clothes, they die. Do you understand? They die." The word pierced the fog. She blinked. A tear leaked from her eye. She nodded, her movements jerky. She began to strip the sodden rags from the baby. Marcus turned his attention to the older kids. He worked efficiently, stripping away the wet fabric, drying their small, shivering bodies with a rough towel, and wrapping them in the thick military-grade wool blankets. He placed them on his mattress, close to the cast-iron stove. He built a fire. He used a block of his recycled C4 as a starter, a small piece no bigger than a coin. He lit it with a match. The explosive burned with a furious, intense white heat, igniting the damp kindling instantly. Within minutes, the stove was roaring, radiating a life-saving heat into the room. He put a kettle of water on the top plate, hot fluids, sugar. They needed energy to restart their metabolisms. While the water heated, Marcus sat back on his heels and observed. The woman had wrapped herself and the baby in a large poncho. She was sitting as close to the stove as she dared, rocking back and forth. The color was slowly returning to the children's faces. The shivering had restarted. A good sign. It meant their bodies were fighting again. Max approached the mattress. The dog sniffed the children carefully. He licked the hand of the boy, who was staring at the ceiling with wide, traumatized eyes. The boy turned his head and buried his face in the dog's neck. Max sighed and lay down along the edge of the bed, a living barrier between the strangers and the rest of the room. He looked at Marcus, his tail giving a single, slow thump. Situation stabilized. Marcus brewed a pot of tea, heavily sweetened with wild honey he traded for in the village. He poured it into tin cups. He handed one to the woman. She took it, her hands shaking so badly the liquid sloshed over the rim, scalding her fingers. She didn't flinch. She stared at the steam rising from the cup as if it were a spirit. "Drink," Marcus said. Slowly, she took a sip, then another. The sugar and heat hit her system. Her eyes cleared. She looked around the room properly for the first time. She saw the tactical gear on the walls, the radio, the maps, the knife sheathed on Marcus's belt. She saw the scar on his neck, illuminated by the firelight. She saw the size of him, the way he moved, predatory, controlled, silent. Fear returned to her eyes, sharp and intelligent. She pulled the poncho tighter, hiding the baby. Her hand moved subtly beneath the fabric, and Marcus, with his peripheral vision honed by years of threat detection, saw her grip a small, sharp piece of driftwood she must have salvaged from the river. A pathetic weapon, but she held it like a shiv. "You are not police," she said. Her voice was raspy, broken by the water she had swallowed. But the Portuguese was accented with the lilt of the deep indigenous tribes upriver. "No," Marcus replied, sitting on a wooden crate on the opposite side of the stove, giving her space. "I am not police." "Who are you?" she asked. "Why do you live alone in the devil's throat?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "So that's what the locals called this inlet." "My name is Marcus. I'm a..." He paused. How to explain retired Navy SEAL to a woman who probably had never seen the ocean? "I was a soldier, a long time ago. Now I just want quiet." She looked at the children sleeping on his bed. She looked at Max guarding them. "Soldiers kill," she said. "You saved. Sometimes you have to do one to do the other," Marcus said darkly. She took another sip of tea. The warmth was loosening her tongue, or maybe the shock was wearing off, and the adrenaline of survival was kicking in. "My name is Janaína," she whispered. "Where did you come from, Janaína? Who put you in the river in a storm?" Marcus asked. He needed intel. If someone had done this to her, they might come looking. Or worse, they might be close. Janaína looked at the fire. Her expression hardened. It was a look of hatred so pure it almost distorted her features. "The Colonel," she spat the word. "He calls himself the Colonel. He is not military. He is a garimpero, a king of mud and mercury. He took our village 3 moons ago. He killed the men. He made the women work." Marcus felt a cold tightening in his gut. He knew the type. Warlords of the jungle. Men who ruled by the machete and the bribe. "I ran," she continued, her voice trembling with rage. "I stole a canoe. I took my sister's children. She died in the sickness. And my baby. I waited for the storm. I thought the rain would hide us. I didn't know the river would get angry." She looked at Marcus. "He will come," she said with absolute certainty. "He thinks he owns us. He thinks he owns everything the river touches. He has fast boats. He has men with rifles. If he finds us here..." She stopped. She looked at the shack. It was sturdy, but it was wood. It wasn't a fortress. "You should have let us drown," she said, her voice hollow. "If he finds you with us, he will peel your skin off while you are still alive. That is his favorite game." Marcus stood up. He walked to the window and looked out through a crack in the shutter. The storm was still raging, hiding the world in a chaotic gray blur. But in his mind, he was already laying out sectors of fire. He was counting his ammunition. He was calculating engagement distances. He turned back to her. The firelight cast his shadow tall against the wall. "Let him come," Marcus said. His voice was low, devoid of bravado, filled only with the cold, flat certainty of a professional killer. "I've met men like your colonel before, in the desert, in the mountains. They all think they are gods because they carry a gun and scare women." He walked over to the weapon rack and picked up his shotgun. He began to load shells into the tube magazine. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. "He thinks he owns the river," Marcus said, looking at Janaína. "But he's never met the thing that lives in this shack. An in thumb." Max lifted his head and growled low in his throat, syncing with Marcus's mood. Janaína watched him. For the first time, she lowered the piece of driftwood she was holding. She looked at the scar on his neck, at the steady hands loading the weapon. She realized that she hadn't been rescued by a good Samaritan. She had been rescued by a warrior. And for a woman who had been hunted by hyenas, finding a lion was the only hope left. The night stretched on. The warmth of the stove fought against the cold of the storm. Inside the fortress of silence, the lines were drawn. The refugees slept, guarded by a dog who never blinked. And Marcus sat by the window, watching the rain, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the past to collide with the present. The storm outside was dangerous, yes, but the storm coming upriver, that was the one he was born to fight. The hours between midnight and dawn in the Amazon are usually the domain of the jaguar and the caiman, a time when the jungle breathes a little slower and the darkness feels absolute. But tonight, inside the stilt house, time had lost its natural rhythm. The storm had passed its peak, leaving behind a sullen, dripping quiet that was in some ways more unnerving than the roar of the wind. The threat of the river had receded, but the threat of the river's master, the colonel, was growing with every passing minute. Marcus was in motion. He moved through the small space of the shack with the silent economy of a man preparing for a siege. He didn't run. Rushing leads to mistakes. He was methodical. He secured the shutters on the windows, engaging the heavy steel latches he had welded himself. He checked the sight lines. He extinguished the main lantern, leaving only a single, shielded tactical red light burning low on the table. Enough to see movement, but not enough to ruin night vision or be seen clearly from the outside. Janaína watched him from the corner near the stove. She had fed the baby and settled the older children back to sleep under the wool blankets. The warmth of the fire had dried her clothes and stopped her shivering, but a different kind of cold had settled in her eyes. She watched Marcus check the action of his shotgun, then move to a metal locker and pull out a pristine AR-15 rifle, wiping the oil from the receiver. She saw how his hands, which she had noticed trembling earlier when he held a cup, were now steady as stone. The weapon acted as a stabilizer for his soul. She stood up slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the wood. She walked toward the shelves where Marcus kept his museum, a collection of items that didn't fit with the modern tactical gear. There were strange river stones, a dried piranha jaw, and old faded photographs of men in desert camouflage standing in front of Humvees. But her eyes locked onto a small object resting on a piece of velvet cloth on the top shelf. It was an old military lensatic compass. The paint was worn down to the brass on the edges. The glass face was cracked. It looked like trash, yet it was given a place of honor. Janaína reached out. Her hand hovered over it. "Don't touch that," Marcus said from across the room. His voice wasn't angry, but it was sharp, a command. She froze. She didn't pull her hand back. She stared at the compass. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a vibration of shock that made Max lift his head and whine. Marcus walked over to her. He loomed over her, a dark shape in the red light. "It was a gift," he said, "from a man who died a long time ago. A man who didn't have to die." Janaína picked up the compass, defying his order. She turned it over. Scratched into the brass backplate was a symbol. It wasn't a name. It was a crude, hand-carved drawing of a harpy eagle with spread wings, and below it, 3 jagged lines representing a river current. She traced the carving with her thumb. Tears welled up in her eyes, hot and fast. "This isn't a gift," she said, turning to face the giant soldier. "This is my father's mark. He carved this. I watched him do it by the fire when I was a girl. He said it was so he could always find his way back to the river spirits." Marcus stared at her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked at the woman, the high cheekbones, the fierce eyes, and suddenly he saw the resemblance. He saw the face of the scout who had guided his team through the green hell 10 years ago. He took a step back, leaning against the heavy wooden table, as if the air had been punched out of him. "Tupar," Marcus whispered. His name was Tupar. Janaína nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. That was his name. He was the best tracker in the Upper Negro. He left one day to guide a group of foreigners, soldiers, and he never came back. We were told the river took him. We never saw a body. We never saw his compass. Marcus closed his eyes. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't in the shack anymore. He was back in the deep jungle 10 years ago. A covert op, CIA tasking, search and destroy on a cocaine lab. The intel was bad. They walked into a kill zone. He didn't drown, Marcus said, his voice thick with the gravel of old grief. We were ambushed, mercenaries, heavily armed. We were pinned down in a ravine, taking heavy fire. I took a round to the leg. I couldn't move. He looked at Janaína, needing her to understand the weight of what he was saying. Your father? He wasn't a combatant. He was just a guide. He could have run. He knew the jungle better than anyone. He could have disappeared and left us to die. But he didn't. Marcus swallowed hard. He saw I was hit. He picked up my rifle. He drew their fire. He ran out into the open, screaming at them, making them look at him so my team could drag me to the extraction point. He bought us 3 minutes. 3 minutes of life paid for with his own. The silence in the shack was absolute. Even the rain seemed to stop to listen. I went back for him, Marcus continued, his voice breaking. After the airstrike cleared the area, I found him. I buried him under a samauma tree. I took his compass so I could bring it to his family. But the mission was classified. Black Ops. My commanders wouldn't let me go to the village. They put me on a chopper and flew me out. I've carried this compass for 10 years, waiting, looking for a ghost. Janaína clutched the compass to her chest. She sobbed, a sound of release and pain that had been trapped for a decade. She looked at Marcus not as a stranger, not even as a savior, but as a brother bound by blood and sacrifice. He saved you, she whispered. He saved me, Marcus affirmed. And every day since then I've wondered why a fisherman would die for a foreign soldier. He looked at the children sleeping on the bed. He looked at the baby, and then he looked at Janaína. The realization settled over him like armor. Now I know, Marcus said. He didn't save me for my sake. He saved me so I could be here tonight. For you, it wasn't chance. It wasn't a random current that pushed her canoe into his sector. It was a debt being called in. The universe was balancing the ledger. Tupar had given his life for Marcus. Now Marcus had to give his protection to Tupar's blood. The dynamic in the room shifted tectonically. Before, Marcus was helping a refugee out of charity. Now, he was fulfilling a sacred obligation. This wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a payment. Max sensed the change. The dog walked over to Marcus and leaned against him, then walked to Janaína and licked her hand, holding the compass. The pack was united. Marcus walked to the weapons locker. He pulled out a heavy handgun, a .45 caliber tactical pistol. He checked the magazine, racked the slide, and engaged the safety. He walked over to Janaína. Do you know how to use this? He asked. She wiped her eyes. She looked at the gun. My father taught me to shoot a hunting rifle, never a handgun. Point and squeeze, Marcus said, placing the heavy weapon in her hand. If they come through that door, you don't hesitate. You don't warn them. You shoot until it clicks. She gripped the gun. Her hands were steady. She was her father's daughter. They are coming, aren't they? She asked. Yes, Marcus said, turning to the window slit. The storm is clearing. The colonel will want his property back, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with. Marcus picked up his rifle and the shotgun. He began to position ammunition caches around the windows. He thinks he's coming to rob a house, Marcus growled, the warrior spirit of the seal fully awakened, fueled by the debt to the dead scout. He's about to walk into a memorial service. A sound drifted in from the river, faint, distant, the whine of high-speed engines. Not one boat, 3, maybe 4. Max ran to the door and let out a single sharp bark, the perimeter alarm. Marcus looked at Janaína. Get in the back room. Put the mattress over the kids. Stay low. She nodded. She looked at the compass one last time, shoved it into her pocket, and gripped the pistol. Kill them, she said. It wasn't a plea. It was an order. Kill them all. Marcus turned to the door. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't tired. He was exactly where he was meant to be, at the exact time he was meant to be there. "Max," he said softly. "Guard." The dog took his position by the back room door. Marcus took his position by the window. The debt was about to be paid in lead. The transition from waiting to contact is a threshold that few people ever cross consciously. For the uninitiated, violence happens to them. A sudden car crash, a mugging, a fall. But for the professional, the threshold is a calculated line in the sand. Captain Marcus had drawn his line at the edge of the wooden dock that connected his stilt house to the rising river. The sound of the engines died away, replaced by the slap of paddles and the hushed, aggressive whispers of men who were used to taking what they wanted without resistance. The colonel hadn't come alone. Marcus, peering through the slats of the reinforced shutter, counted 3 distinct heat signatures through his monocular night vision device before the batteries finally surrendered to the cold. 3 boats, at least 8 to 10 men, a platoon-sized element against 1 shooter and a dog. Inside the shack, the darkness was absolute. Marcus had extinguished every light source, turning the interior into a void. To an outsider stepping in from the relatively brighter exterior, where the moon was trying to break through the storm clouds, the shack would be a black hole. It was a basic principle of CQB, close quarters battle. The eye takes up to 20 minutes to fully adapt to the dark. Marcus's eyes were already adapted. The men coming up the stairs would be blind for the first vital seconds of the breach. He moved to the center of the room, positioning himself behind the heavy oak table he had turned on its side. It wasn't ballistic cover. Rifle rounds would punch through wood, but it was concealment. It hid his silhouette. "Janaina," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I'm here," came the reply from the back room. Her voice was steady. She was holding the line. "Don't shoot until they are through the bedroom door. Let Max handle the hallway." Max was positioned in the narrow corridor that separated the main living space from the back room. It was a fatal funnel, a choke point where the enemy would be forced to bunch up. The dog lay flat, invisible against the dark floorboards, his breathing shallow and controlled. He didn't need to see. The scent of the approaching men, reeking of cheap cologne, gun oil, and adrenaline, was flooding the house like a noxious gas. Max's lips peeled back, revealing his white teeth in the dark, a silent grin of anticipation. Footsteps thumped on the front porch, heavy boots testing the wood. "Oi, cabocla!" a voice boomed from outside. It was deep, gravelly, accustomed to shouting over mining machinery. "The colonel. I know you're in there. I see the boat. Come out, and I'll only break one of your legs. Make me come in, and I'll feed the baby to the caimans." Janaina didn't make a sound. The discipline of the hunted. Marcus tightened his grip on the AR-15. The safety selector switch clicked silently from safe to semi. He controlled his heart rate, forcing it down to 60 beats per minute. He wasn't angry anymore. He was a machine processing data. Distance, 5 meters. Barrier, wooden door. Ammunition, 30 rounds of 5.56 millimeter green tip. The colonel laughed outside. "Break it down." There was no cinematic kick, just the heavy thud of a battering ram, likely a log found on the bank, slamming into the door. The wood splintered. The reinforced deadbolt Marcus had installed held for the first blow, groaning in protest. Thud. The frame cracked. Thud. The door flew open, crashing against the inner wall. A beam of light sliced into the room. A powerful tactical flashlight mounted on a rifle swept the darkness, blindingly bright. Dust motes danced in the beam. "Clear right! Clear left!" a mercenary shouted, stepping into the room. He was followed by 2 others. They wore mismatched camouflage and carried AK-47s. They moved with a sloppy arrogance, sweeping their lights high, looking for a woman standing up. They didn't look low. They didn't check the corners. Marcus let them enter. He let all 3 cross the threshold. He needed them committed. The point man's light swept over the overturned table. "Contact!" he screamed. Marcus fired. It wasn't a spray of bullets. It was a double tap. Pop, pop. The sound of the unsuppressed rifle inside the wooden box of the house was deafening, a physical overpressure that rattled the teeth. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a microsecond like a strobe light. The point man dropped, his chest armor shattered. The second man spun, firing blindly toward the flash. Bullets tore into the wall above Marcus's head, showering him with splinters. Marcus didn't flinch. He shifted aim. The second man was silhouetted against the open door by the moonlight outside. Center mass. One shot. The man crumpled backward, knocking the third man down. Chaos erupted. "Ambush! It's a trap!" the third man yelled, scrambling backward onto the porch, firing his AK wildly into the room. Marcus stayed low. He didn't chase. He held his sector. Outside, the colonel was screaming orders. "Suppressing fire! Light it up!" A hail of bullets shredded the front of the shack. Windows shattered. Wood exploded inward. Tin cups flew off the shelves. It was a storm of lead. Marcus pressed himself flat against the floor, covering his head. He knew the ballistics. The angle was high. They were shooting from the dock up into the house. As long as he stayed on the deck, the rounds would pass over him. Inside the back room, the baby started to cry, a thin, piercing wail that cut through the gunfire. "They hear the baby!" Janaina screamed from the back. "Stay down!" Marcus roared back. The shooting stopped abruptly. They were reloading, or moving. Marcus heard the sound of footsteps running along the side of the house. They were flanking him. They were going for the back window, the one that led directly into the bedroom where the family was hiding. Marcus couldn't move there in time without exposing himself to the front door. "Max!" Marcus shouted. "Back!" The German shepherd understood. He abandoned the hallway and launched himself toward the back bedroom. The wooden shutter on the back window smashed inward, kicked open from the outside. A man tried to climb through, a machete in his hand, thinking he had found the soft underbelly of the defense. He found a buzzsaw. Max hit the man mid-air. The dog didn't go for a limb. He went for the face. The impact threw the man back out the window, with Max attached to him. They fell 6 feet into the mud below the house. Marcus heard the man screaming, a primal, gurgling shriek of absolute terror, mixed with the savage, wet sounds of a dog tearing meat. Then a gunshot, a pistol crack from under the house. Max yelped, a sharp, high sound of pain that pierced Marcus's heart. Then silence from below. "Max!" Marcus yelled, his composure cracking for the first time. No answer. Fury, cold and white-hot, flooded Marcus's veins. They had hurt his dog, the only living thing he loved, the only family he had left. The tactical computer in his brain shut down. The berserker protocol engaged. He stood up. He didn't care about cover anymore. He walked to the open front door, stepping over the body of the mercenary he had dropped. He raised his rifle. On the dock, the colonel and 4 other men were regrouping, illuminated by their own flashlights. They looked up, startled to see the prey walking out to meet them. Marcus didn't look like a man. Bathed in the smoke of the gunfight, debris falling from his vest, he looked like a demon of the forest. He didn't fire immediately. He raised his voice, projecting over the rain. "You shot my dog," Marcus said. The sentence wasn't a complaint. It was a verdict. He raised the rifle and opened fire. He walked down the stairs, firing with a rhythmic, terrifying cadence. Bang, bang, bang. He wasn't suppressing them. He was hunting them. He moved with the relentless forward momentum of a tsunami. The mercenaries on the dock scrambled. They had expected a scared victim hiding under a bed. They were facing a Tier 1 operator who had just decided that he didn't care if he lived or died, as long as they died first. One man fell into the river. Another took a round to the shoulder and dropped his weapon. The colonel, realizing the tactical error of engaging a Reaper, turned and ran for the boat. Marcus reached the bottom of the stairs. He was out in the open. Bullets kicked up mud around his feet. He didn't stop. He reloaded while moving, a smooth mechanical action that took less than a second. He reached the edge of the dock. The colonel was trying to start the engine of the lead boat. Marcus aimed, not at the man, at the engine block. He dumped the rest of the magazine into the outboard motor. Sparks flew, metal sheared, and the engine died with a metallic crunch. The colonel was stranded. Marcus dropped the empty rifle. It was out of ammo. He pulled the tomahawk axe from his belt, a weapon he used for wood, but designed for war. He stepped onto the boat. The colonel pulled a nickel-plated revolver, his hand shaking. "Stay back! I own this river!" the colonel screamed. Marcus stepped forward, ignoring the gun pointed at his chest. "You rented it," Marcus growled. "And the lease is up." The colonel pulled the trigger. Click. A misfire. Cheap ammunition in a wet climate. Marcus swung the tomahawk. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the hand holding the gun. The axe buried itself in the wood of the boat's gunwale, pinning the colonel's sleeve and trapping his arm. The man screamed, dropping the revolver into the bilge water. Marcus grabbed the colonel by the throat and lifted him off his feet, slamming him against the console of the boat. "Where is my dog?" Marcus roared in the man's face. "If he dies, you drown." A sound came from the mud bank under the house. A limp, dragging sound. Marcus froze. He turned his head. Max was pulling himself out of the mud. He was covered in black slime, bleeding from a graze wound on his flank. But he was alive. He was limping, but his head was up. The dog looked at Marcus, looked at the colonel, and let out a low, rumbling bark. "I'm here, boss. Finish it." Marcus looked back at the colonel. The man was broken. He was sobbing, terrified by the violence, by the failure of his gun, by the indestructible dog. Marcus released the throat, letting the man slump to the deck. He picked up his rifle. The fight was over. The enemy was broken. But the night was still full of questions. The silence that reclaims a battlefield is heavy, distinct, and oppressive. It is not the peaceful silence of nature. It is a vacuum where ringing ears and racing hearts try to recalibrate to a world that isn't trying to kill them. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a dripping, sodden world that smelled of wet charcoal, copper blood, and the ozone of spent primers. Marcus stood on the deck of the captured boat, his chest heaving. The colonel lay at his feet, curled into a ball, clutching his pinned sleeve, weeping softly. The arrogance of the warlord had evaporated, leaving only a small, terrified man who had realized too late that money cannot buy survival against a force of nature. Marcus didn't feel triumph. He felt the crushing weight of the adrenaline crash, a physiological tax that demanded payment in exhaustion. His hands, steady as granite during the shooting, now began to tremble with a violent, uncontrollable shake. He secured the colonel with the man's own belt, lashing him to the steering console. He checked the other mercenaries. 2 were gone, having swum for the far bank in the dark. 1 was groaning on the dock with a shoulder wound. The dead lay where they fell. The threat was neutralized. The perimeter was cold. Marcus turned and ran up the stairs, ignoring the burning in his own lungs. "Max!" he called out, his voice cracking. Inside the shattered living room, the scene was a tableau of survival. Janaina had emerged from the back room. She wasn't cowering. She had placed the children behind the heavy stove and was kneeling on the floor next to Max. The dog was lying on his side, panting shallowly. The black mud from under the house coated his flank, but fresh, bright red blood was seeping through the grime on his hindquarter. Marcus dropped his rifle on the table and slid to his knees beside the dog. He was afraid to look. He had seen men take rounds to the gut and survive, and he had seen men take grazes and die of shock. "Let me see, buddy. Let me see," Marcus whispered, his hands hovering over the wound. The tremor in his fingers was bad now. He couldn't stop it. The fear of losing the only family he had left was paralyzing him. Janaina reached out. Her hand, small and scarred from labor, covered Marcus's shaking hand. She didn't speak. She just held him steady for a second, grounding him. Then she pulled his hand toward the wound. "It passed through," she said softly. Her voice was calm, the voice of a mother who has tended to scraped knees and fevered brows. The bullet didn't stay inside. It cut the muscle, but it missed the bone. Marcus blinked, forcing his vision to clear. He looked. She was right. It was a through-and-through graze on the fleshy part of the hip. Messy, bloody, painful, but not lethal. The femoral artery was intact. He let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "Okay," he muttered, switching back to corpseman mode. "Okay, I need my kit. Top shelf, red bag." Janaina moved instantly. She grabbed the trauma kit and brought it to him. She didn't wait for instructions. She opened a bottle of water and began to wash the mud away from the wound, while Marcus prepared the clotting gauze and the suture kit. They worked in tandem, a silent surgical team. Marcus flushed the wound with saline. Max whined and tried to lift his head. "Shh, easy, Max, easy," Marcus soothed. Janaina stroked the dog's head, whispering words in her native Nyingatu tongue, soft, rhythmic sounds that seemed to act as a tranquilizer. The dog's eyes softened. He licked her hand. Marcus threaded the suture needle. This was the hard part. He had to stitch the skin without anesthetic. "Hold him," Marcus said. Janaina leaned over the dog, wrapping her arms around his chest, burying her face in his neck. She held him with a strength that belied her size. Marcus began to stitch. Max growled, a low rumble of pain, but he didn't snap. He trusted the man, and he trusted the woman holding him. 5 stitches later, it was done. Marcus bandaged the area and administered a shot of antibiotics. He sat back on his heels, wiping blood from his hands onto his pants. He looked at Janaina. Her dress was stained with his dog's blood. Her hair was wild. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were fierce with life. "You have good hands," Marcus said. "Steady. My father taught me to dress wounds," she replied. "He said a hunter must know how to fix what he breaks." She looked at the compass on the shelf, which had miraculously stayed in place during the firefight. "He would have liked you," she added. "You fight like a jaguar. Fast, quiet." Marcus looked at the compass, then at the destruction around them. The door was gone. The walls were riddled with holes. His sanctuary was violated. But looking at the children peeking out from behind the stove, safe and unhurt, he didn't care about the wood and nails. "I called the federal police on the colonel's radio." Marcus lied. He hadn't, but he would. "They will be here by noon. The colonel is a wanted man. They will be happy to find him tied up with a bow." Janaina nodded. She stood up and went to the stove. She stoked the fire, adding fresh wood. She filled the kettle. "Then we need to eat," she said pragmatically. "The children are hungry, and you look like a ghost." She started making tapioca flatbreads with the supplies Marcus had. It was a surreal scene of domesticity in the middle of a war zone. Marcus watched her. He realized that the dynamic of rescuer and victim had dissolved completely. They were partners now. She had held the line in the back room. She had helped save Max. She was feeding the troops. The sun rose fully, illuminating the wreckage. The colonel shouted something from the boat, a threat or a plea, but nobody answered. He was irrelevant now. Marcus took a cup of coffee from Janaina. He walked out to the porch, limping slightly from a bruise he didn't remember getting. He looked at the river. The floodwaters were receding, leaving a layer of silt on the banks. The storm had brought destruction, yes, but it had also brought something else. It had washed away the walls Marcus had built around his own life. He looked back inside. Max was sleeping, bandaged and drugged, with the baby curled up against his back. The older children were eating bread, watching Marcus with wide, worshipful eyes. He had paid a debt to a ghost by saving them. But looking at the peace in that shattered room, Marcus wondered if the ghost of Tupar wasn't the one paying him back. "We need to go to the village," Janaina said, stepping onto the porch beside him. "To my father's people, not the ones who were killed, but the elders upriver. They need to know the colonel is finished, and they need to see the compass." Marcus nodded. "We'll go, as soon as the boat is fixed." It wasn't just a trip, it was a pilgrimage. Marcus knew that returning the compass wouldn't just be closing a chapter for her, it would be closing the book on his own guilt. The soldier who died saving him 10 years ago had sent his daughter to save Marcus from his own solitude. The circle was closing. The journey to the upper reaches of the tributary took 2 days. The river, which nights before had been a raging monster of brown foam and debris, was now a sheet of glass, reflecting the green walls of the jungle. Marcus piloted the repair-patched skiff, the engine humming a steady, reliable rhythm. Janaina sat in the bow, looking forward, her face set with a mixture of anticipation and grief. The children slept on mats in the hull, exhausted by the trauma and the heat. Max, his hindquarter bandaged and clean, sat by Marcus's side, his nose testing the wind, ears perking up at the calls of macaws and howler monkeys. They were moving into territory that didn't appear on Marcus's GPS. This was the deep Amazon, the sanctuary of tribes that had learned centuries ago that survival meant invisibility. The further they went, the more Marcus felt the weight of the modern world slipping away. The radio silence was absolute. On the afternoon of the second day, Janaína signaled to cut the engine. Marcus drifted the boat toward a bank that looked exactly like every other mile of jungle they had passed. But as they drew closer, he saw the signs. A notched tree trunk, a canoe hidden under palm fronds, the faint smell of wood smoke. They were watched. Marcus felt it in the hairs on his arms. He didn't reach for his rifle. He kept his hands on the wheel, visible and open. Figures emerged from the green wall. They weren't warriors in war paint this time. They were a community. Men, women, and children. Silent and observant. They didn't look like victims. They looked like the land itself, enduring and unmovable. Janaína stood up. She spoke in her native tongue, her voice ringing clear over the water. It was a declaration of return. An old woman, tiny and bent with age, stepped forward from the group. Her hair was white, her skin a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp black obsidian. She leaned on a staff of ironwood. This was the matriarch, the keeper of memory. Marcus beached the boat. He helped Janaína out, then lifted the children down. The tribe remained still, their eyes fixed on the giant stranger and the wolf dog. Janaína walked to the old woman. She knelt in the sand. They touched foreheads, a gesture of profound intimacy and shared sorrow. They spoke in whispers. Janaína gestured to the boat, to the children, and then, finally, to Marcus. The matriarch looked at him. She walked past her granddaughter, moving with a surprising strength across the sand. She stopped in front of Marcus. She had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. She reached out a withered hand and touched the scar on his neck. Her fingers were rough, like tree bark. She said something in Hingatu. "She says you carry the mark of the jaguar," Janaína translated, her voice thick with emotion. "He who survives the bite." Chu. Marcus reached into his tactical vest. He pulled out the velvet cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the battered brass compass. The sun caught the metal. A gasp went through the crowd. They knew this object. It was a relic, a piece of a man who had vanished into the mist 10 years ago and never returned. Marcus held it out to the old woman. "Your son," Marcus said, his Portuguese slow and respectful. "He saved my life. He gave me 10 years of breath I didn't deserve. I brought him home." The old woman took the compass. Her hands trembled, not with age, but with the shock of a closed circle. She ran her thumb over the crude carving of the eagle on the back. She pressed the cold metal to her cheek and began to keen, a high, mournful song that wasn't just sadness, it was a song of release. The spirit of Tupá, wandering for a decade, had finally found its way back to the fire. The tension in the village broke. The men came forward, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. The women surrounded Janaína and the children. Max, usually so guarded, allowed the village children to touch his fur, sensing that this was a safe zone. That night, they didn't sleep in the boat. They slept in the communal lodge, surrounded by the smell of roasting fish and resin smoke. There was a ceremony. Marcus didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. The matriarch painted streaks of red uricum dye on his cheeks and on Max's forehead. It wasn't war paint, it was a mark of kinship. He was no longer a stranger. He was parenté. Marcus sat by the fire, watching the embers rise into the smoke hole of the roof. He felt a lightness in his chest that terrified him. For years, his survivor's guilt had been his armor. It had kept him sharp, angry, and isolated. Now that armor was stripped away. Tupá's death wasn't a waste. It was a seed that had grown into this moment. The saving of his daughter, his grandchildren, and ultimately, the saving of Marcus himself. The return trip to the shack was different. They weren't fleeing a storm. They were commuting home. When they arrived at the stilt house, The damage from the firefight was still there. The bullet holes, the broken door. But it didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a fortress that had held. Marcus started repairs immediately. Janaina worked the garden. The children played with Max in the shallow water, their laughter chasing away the ghosts of the colonel and his men. One evening, Marcus sat on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset. He held a cup of coffee in a steady hand. Janaina came out and sat beside him. "The river is quiet tonight," she said. "It's respecting the peace," Marcus replied. She looked at him. "You know the colonel will send others. Eventually. Let them come," Marcus said, patting the receiver of his rifle leaning against the wall. "We have the high ground, and we have the map." He tapped his head. The lessons from Tupa, the knowledge of the terrain, the alliance with the tribe upriver. He was part of a network now. He wasn't just a sentinel guarding a shack. He was a guardian of the river. Max trotted up the stairs, shaking water from his coat. He squeezed between them, looking out at the jungle with a proprietary air. Marcus looked at his family, the one born of blood, and the one forged in water and fire. The storm of destiny had tried to break them, but it had only washed them clean. He was ready for whatever the current brought next.